This video is about how what used to be called multiple personality disorder, today it's called dissociative identity disorder, how that has been suggested into existence by psychologists, psychiatrists, and medical doctors using hypnosis, suggestion, and some drugs in very unethical ways. This has been one of the biggest scandals in psychology, and in this video I want to go into some detail in terms of how this actually happened, the historical context that it evolved out of, and some of the factors that contributed to this mess and still continues to contribute to this mess. This is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. So this whole multiple personality disorder thing, as it used to be called in the DSM-3, did not evolve out of a vacuum. In Western culture, we have a long tradition of people believing that demons could enter their body and take over control. And hundreds of years ago, there's been many cases of people claiming that demons have entered their body, that they've been victims of demonic possessions, and they've done weird things and then claimed amnesia for the periods in which the demons took over. Now, in the 1800s, when materialism became more firmly entrenched as a kind of ruling ideology or framework, the whole idea of demon possession kind of fell out of favor. The supernatural seeming forces behind this fell out of favor. And in the last quarter of the 1800s, there were quite a few cases of what's called multiple personality disorder in France and some in the United States. And all of these cases seem to have involved out of psychiatrists and psychologists who practice hypnosis, using hypnosis to kind of explore psychopathology. So a lot of these early cases in the last quarter of the 1800s came through people like Pierre Janet, Joseph Breuer. In the United States, people like Morton Prince. Now, Pierre Janet had a theory of dissociation, that ideas or sets of ideas could become dissociated from like the main framework of ideas, and in that way create a dual consciousness of sorts, and that these dual consciousnesses could exist within the same person and operate kind of independently of each other. And a lot of these cases came through Pierre Janet and people like Joseph Breuer. Now, Janet, of course, was associated with Jean-Martin Charcot, who also espoused similar ideas. And we'll get back to Charcot in a little bit. Now, in the late 1800s and the turn of the following century, you had quite a few cases in Paris or in France. You had a few cases in the United States. It was quite common, a quite common way of dealing with distress. Now, the interesting thing at the time was that Freud and the psychoanalysts did not uncover, or I should say create, any cases of multiple personality disorder at all. Now, Janet thought of multiple personality disorder as a form of hysteria, But the really interesting thing is if you look at people like Genet and Breuer, um, when they, and I should say, created these cases of multiple personality disorder, they did not, in the vast majority of cases, claim that sexual abuse or repressed memories of sexual abuse was the cause of multiple personality disorder. Freud, on the other hand, who never had or diagnosed anyone with multiple personality disorder, he claimed that hysteria was a result of hidden or repressed memories of sexual abuse. The repressed memories of sexual abuse during his seduction theory phase. And of course, later it just became, sexual conflicts. So when Freud ended up dominating the scene in the early 1900s, the people like Genet who emphasized dissociation lost their appeal, and between 1920 and 1970, I think there were just a few cases of multiple personality disorder created or discovered worldwide. Like, it really went out of favor. And in many cases, in most countries, you never had one single documented case. For example, in Japan, you had 0 cases of this. Most psychiatrists, most psychologists would go through their entire careers never claiming to have seen any patient who suffered with multiple personality disorder, or what's today is called DID, or dissociative identity disorder. Now, it's really interesting to look at how multiple personality disorder has changed, because in the late 1800s and up until like 1920, that period, in the vast majority of cases, the people who had the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder had just 2 alleged personalities or alters. And hardly anyone claimed that this was the result of sexual abuse. That was usually not the case. In the vast majority of instances too, and this has been true historically, most people who get this diagnosis are women. So it was very quiet around this. And then in 1957, there was a book produced in the United States called The 3 Faces of Eve by a guy called Thigpen and Cleckley. And this was a case of a woman called Eve White, who Thigpen, the psychiatrist, first looked at as a kind of boring housewife. She struggled with some headaches and some marital issues. And then during a session where the psychiatrist kind of offered some funky suggestions, she suddenly emerged seemingly as a different persona. And she said that her name was Eve Black. And she seemed to be everything that Eve, the Eve White was not. She was sensual and sexy and flirtatious and full of life and all sorts of stuff. And then later on, a third alter called Jane emerged, and Thigpen was able to integrate these so-called alters, and all seemed fine. This book was very popular, and it also turned into a movie. And then you started to get more cases. And at the same time, in the 50s, in New York, there was a woman called Shirley Mason who went to see a psychiatrist by the name of Cornelia Wilbur. And Cornelia Wilbur did 2,300 sessions with this poor woman and evoked 16 different alters before integrating all of them. And they developed this kind of codependent relationship where they ended up living together, I think, for the last 11 years of I don't know whoever died first. Now, Cornelia Wilbur suggested these alters or personalities. She, through suggestion, helped the client create this sense of being all these different alters. I'll quote from Debbie Nathan's book, who in 2012 wrote the book Sybil Exposed. Sybil's 16 personalities had not popped up spontaneously, but were provoked over many years of rogue treatment that violated practically every ethical standard of practice for mental health practitioners. Dr. Wilbur had approached Sybil's health problems with a predetermined diagnosis that brooked no alternative explanations. In her therapy, she had made extravagant, sadistic use of habit-forming, mind-bending drugs. After years of this behavior, the two women developed a slavish mutual dependency upon each other. Toward the end of their lives, they ended up living together. Anyways, Sybil the book Sybil was written in 1973, turned into a movie, and after that, the whole MPD industry exploded. Like, you had more cases in the next 5 years than you had throughout the last 100 years combined. You had tens of thousands of cases. This became like a mini epidemic. And of course, after Sybil, it was very common for patients to have 10, 20, even 100 of these different alters. And what always became the source of multiple personality disorder was repressed memories of sexual abuse, just like what was claimed with Sybil. So the whole theory became a combination of Pierre Janet's old dissociation theory combined with Sigmund Freud's discarded seduction theory in a cultural context where the topic of abuse, sexual abuse of children, was finally being spoken about, and also at a time where more radical feminist ideologies and movements were getting more and more traction. So now you had people going to see therapists who had no inkling that they had so-called multiple personalities, who were suggested to that, have you heard of multiple personality disorders? And then these alters or parts were called forth and given names. And they were sold the idea that their symptoms and MPD itself was a result of horrible repressed memories of sexual abuse that had been repressed and that were so gruesome that the core personality couldn't handle it, and therefore it had to be outsourced to these various alters who could hold the memories in a dissociated way. And of course, to heal from this, to heal from all the distress that they had in their lives and from multiple personality disorder themselves, they would have to dredge up these alleged repressed memories and alters and integrate them. And the choice therapy was usually a combination of hypnotic parts and regression work combined with various drugs. So this turned into something of an epidemic. It was very popular in the 80s, extremely popular in the 90s in combination with repressed memories of satanic ritual abuse. So in the 1800s, no one had repressed memories of satanic ritual abuse. But as that theory gained traction, that became the major thing. And it most of that industry got shot down around 1997 when there was a bunch of highly successful lawsuits against many of the pioneers of the MPD and recovered memory therapy industry. Um, insurance companies would no longer touch it. Prestigious hospitals would no longer have so-called dissociative disorder units in their hospitals. This basically shut a lot of the industry down. It was renamed into dissociative identity disorder in the DSM-4. And of course, today, around the year 2000, a lot of the traumatologists of old, who were pioneers when it came to stuff like repressed memories and multiple personalities and dissociative identity disorder, started to change their tune, and they started to talk about people not having multiple personalities so much, but having less than one personality. And they kind of jumped ship onto the PTSD industry, these old traumatologists. Now, how on earth are these so-called multiple personality disorders created? Like, what's going on? What is it in our psyche that allows these sort of phenomena to happen? Before we get there, I'll share with you 3 gruesome cases from 3 different countries about this. So in the mid-1980s, there was a woman called Patricia Burgess who suffered from postpartum depression. She was a regular woman, married, had a family, had a good life, but she suffered from postpartum depression. And she went to see a psychologist by the name of Anne-Marie Bowman. And Anne-Marie Bowman had a suspicion that Patricia Burgess might be suffering from multiple personality disorder. So she asked Patricia, have you heard about multiple personality disorder? And as a result of the therapy they did together, which comprised of a lot of hypnosis and suggestion, they evoked 30 different so-called personalities. And of course, Patricia Burgess got more depressed and felt way worse. And she was admitted into what was called the Dissociative Disorder Unit at Rush Hospital in Chicago, run by the medical doctor psychiatrist Bennet Braun, who was considered by many to be like the main guy in this MPD industry. Him and Roberta Sachs and people like that, and Richard Kluft. Richard Kluft, by the way, has the world record of discovering the most alters in a single patient, 4,500. Think about that. These folks were the ones who wrote the guidelines for multiple personality disorder in the DSM. So imagine that. Now, at the Dissociative Disorder Unit in Chicago, Patricia Burgess lived there for 2 years, and through hypnosis and a lot of drugs, Bennet Braun was able to create in her a lot of memories of repressed memories of alleged satanic ritual abuse. So Burgess discovered that she was a high priestess of a satanic cult, and that her 2 sons were also involved in the satanic cult and had been programmed. And they were 5 and 3 years old, so they also were admitted into the dissociative disorder unit and lived there with her mother from 1986 to 1988. Burgess discovered that she had killed numerous babies, that she had eaten parts of fetuses, and that her whole family, except her husband, was involved in this satanic cult. Um, if you'd like to read the whole story, you could read about it in Richard Offshe's excellent book called Making Monsters. Um, Now, what happened eventually was that after 3 years, her insurance ran out, and she had the chance to spend a couple of months away from Bennet Braun and Roberta Sachs and the other psychiatrists. And when there was no one there to drug her or hypnotize her or call forth altars or reward her for these behaviors, they stopped occurring and her head started clearing. And in 1997, Bennet Braun, he was sued by, I think, 11 different patients. There's a lot of horror stories like this to come out of Chicago, but he settled for $10 million in 1997. There was a psychologist called, he's still around, called Christopher Barden, who was also a lawyer who led this interdisciplinary team of folks who helped win numerous of these high-profile cases. This is just one example. You had dissociative disorder units in many places of the United States, and this is not an isolated case. I'll share with you another interesting case here from the UK, and this is the Carol Felsted case. You can watch a very interesting TED Talk by her brother Kevin Felsted on TED Talks on YouTube. She was a nurse who complained of headaches and went to her medical doctor. They couldn't find any medical reason for the headaches, so she was sent to a psychologist. And the psychologist did a lot of hypnotherapy, regression and parts hypnotherapy with her. And he decided, the psychologist wrote in her medical journals, that she has been abused from birth, but she has no recollection of it, but that will appear in due course. Now consider that. There were only two people in the room, and the actual patient had absolutely no memory of this whatsoever. According to her parents and her brother, she was a normal person. But through this hypnotherapy at the Tavistock Clinic in London, she discovered that she was part of a satanic cult, that her parents were the leaders of a satanic cult, and that she committed 8 murders, and that she gave birth to and then had to watch her own children get killed multiple times. Now, of course, medical tests later showed that she had never been pregnant. But when she died, she was estranged from her family. Her parents' family were able to get hold of the medical journals, and imagine the shock of discovering this type of horror. This is something they discovered back in 2005. Now, in both of these cases, the Carol Felsted case and the Patricia Burgess case, the patients ended up actually believing in these memories of repressed sexual abuse and repressed satanic ritual abuse. It was completely real to them. And I would assume that these are highly hypnotizable folks. Herbert Spiegel, the hypnosis pioneer, who had some sessions with Sybil, he disputed the idea that Sybil was a multiple personality. He called her a brilliant hysteric, and a highly hypnotizable person. And he was asked if he wanted to be part of the book Sybil, and he refused when he realized that they were planning to present her as a multiple personality. So I'll give you another horrible case, and this is way closer to home. I live in Norway. This is from Sweden. So from the years of 1994 to 2001, there was a guy called Thomas Quick. His real name is Sture Bergwall, but Thomas Quick was between 1994 and 2001, he was convicted for 8 murders, and later in 2013 he was exonerated for all of those murders. He had absolutely nothing to do with any of them. But what happened with this guy is that he was a very lonely man and had a lot of psychological issues. And after having been part of a failed robbery where he actually tried to rob some people he knew, which was kind of embarrassing, he ended up at this psychiatric hospital called Säter in Stockholm, Sweden. And at that particular hospital, the chief of ideology, if you will, was the psychoanalyst Margit Norell. And Margit Norell was a psychoanalyst who believed in repressed memories of sexual abuse, and she believed in multiple personalities. Now, Thomas Quick was, as I said, a very lonely and socially awkward guy, and he really liked drugs. He really liked benzos especially. And what he did was that he started to read, and he started to claim to have committed various killings. And this, of course, intrigued the nurses, so they got very interested in him, and they gave him a lot of drugs, as a reward. And Margit Norell, the chief psychiatrist, got very interested, and she suggested and believed that he had done all these killings. And as a result of it, he had to have had all these severe repressed traumas from his childhood. So they started to call forth all sorts of alters. And of course, they discovered that there was another guy. What was his name? Let's see if I can find her. Yeah, Stanley. Of course, Thomas Quick was not the murderer. There was this altered personality inside of him called Stanley, who actually did all the killings. There was also a Swedish profiler who had trained at Quantico with the FBI to do profiling, who back in Stockholm got really interested in this because he thought, man, I might have my own serial killer here. And what happened was that Thomas Quick had all these memories, right? And he admitted to, he took credit for actually 39 murders, but he was able to get himself charged and convicted of 8 murders that he had absolutely nothing to do with before he was exonerated in 2013. By the way, he was exonerated not because the system itself, the players in the system, realized that they had made a mistake. He was exonerated largely due to the work of one man, a very courageous journalist called Hannes Rostam, and his partner, who spent 4 years researching this. A lot of hard work, and they were eventually able to show that he had absolutely nothing to do with it, and he retracted his confessions. Now, it's really fascinating because the police actually, and the psychiatrists actually trained him. They would take him to these sites, and they would call out Stanley and have Stanley, show how he killed people and show the rage. And of course, since he had nothing to do with it, none of the details that he told matched. So they had to train him and go, wasn't that rock over there? Or let's stop for today. Let's start tomorrow. Didn't you do this instead? Until his explanations fit. So in this particular case, I don't think Thomas Quick ever believed that he did any of these things. Um, I don't think he had any memories, constructed memories, come up whatsoever. But it's a great idea of it's a great example of how ideologically blinded therapists, with confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance on steroids, can contribute to a disaster like this. So I'm showing you examples from the United States and the UK and Sweden. By the way, 3 of the murders he got convicted for was in Norway. One of them not that far from where I live, and 5 of them were in Sweden. So I'm showing you these 3 different cases just to show you that this was a phenomenon that was not entirely restricted to North America, but had appeal in other places as well. So how does this happen in a session? Well, let me give you an example. Back in 2008, I was on vacation in New York, and there was this Zen teacher called Dennis Mercel, or Genpo Roshi, who had this big mind process, who claimed that he could help people wake up in a weekend. Now, the seminar was actually at the hotel that I stayed, so I attended the 2-day seminar. And on the first day, there was this NLP guy there called Bill Harris, together with Genpo Roshi, who essentially told story after story after story after story about these parts that we all kind of have inside, and set up expectations, built up a framework, offered a lot of suggestions for that. And then the next day, Genpo Roshi would call out these various parts. And lo and behold, a lot of people with great enthusiasm and wonder discovered that they suddenly had all these parts. And this was treated as a pure discovery. Of course, what's way more likely is that these so-called parts were created as a result of the suggestions and the expectations and the frame. It was a co-constructed creation, not a discovery. So what would happen was that, remember that when people are in pain, they're always looking for explanations, right? So psychiatrists and psychologists would say to patients stuff like, do you ever feel like you're not alone, as if there's something else or someone else inside of you, some other force? Or do you ever find yourself doing things as if it's not you really doing it? Like maybe you've been driving your car to your office or home, and you end up home and you suddenly realize, shit, who drove the car? I can't quite recall. It's as if someone else was doing it. And they would offer all these sorts of explanations. And then they would begin to say, well, I would like to call out the part of you that's responsible for X. And does that part have a name? They might suggest that part come forward through ideomotor signals initially. And they might get a name to that part, direct voice. And then they might have the person be that part and speak as that part, and a lot of people probably just role played in a sense, because that's what they sensed that their therapist wanted them to do. But some people who had high hypnotic capacity probably got into this and believed in it, hook, line, and sinker. So I'll give you a interesting, this is from an excellent book called Memory Warp, which I really recommend, by Mark Pendergrast. I'm just going to read something quick for you here. So this is a psychologist called Ralph Allison, who was one of the pioneers in this whole multiple personality movement. So he talks about meeting a patient on day number 2 in the hospital So the following day after a sleepless night, the nervous Dr. Allison informed Jeanette, the client, that the psychologist who saw you yesterday says there's someone else here with you. Jeanette looked puzzled. What I mean is, there's someone inside your head, someone else sharing your body. Still no response. I want to meet the other person. I think I can if you'll give me a little cooperation. He asked her to close her eyes and relax. Then, in a commanding, forceful voice, Allison intoned, "Now I want to talk to whoever or whatever spoke to the psychologist last night. Come out by the time I count to 3. 1, 2, 3. And with that, Jeanette opened her eyes and in a loud, grating voice said, "Okay, Doc, what do you want? And God, it's good to get rid of that piss-ass Jeanette." So this is how they would often call forth these alters. And of course, with some combinations of drugs and a lot of hypnotic work. There's a famous example of this too. It's not only in Sweden where they're nuts with criminal investigation. There's an old case from 1979, the Hillside Strangler case. A murderer by the name of Kenneth Bianchi. He was hypnotized in prison by a very well-known psychologist and hypnosis pioneer by the name of John Watkins. Watkins actually did some great work with soldiers after the Second World War using affect bridge regression therapy. He was also an exponent of parts therapy. He was also sadly an exponent of multiple personality disorder. So I'll read from you very quick. This is also from a great book called Multiple Identities and False Memories by Nicholas Spanos. This is a great book on the topic. What he has here is a verbatim excerpt from a hypnotic interview, this time with suspected multiple named Ken Bianchi. Bianchi had been charged with murder and was interviewed in a forensic context. The interview was videotaped, so this is a transcript of the videotape. Following a hypnotic induction procedure, the clinician, who was John Watkins, by the way, proceeds as follows. I've talked a bit to Ken, but I think that perhaps there might be another part of Ken that I haven't talked to. And I would like to communicate with that other part. And I would like that part to come talk to me. And when you're here, lift the left hand off the chair to signal to me that you are here. Would you please come, part, so I can talk to you? Part, would you come and lift Ken's hand to indicate to me that you're here? Would you talk to me, part, by saying, I am here? Following the last question, Bianchi answered, yes. And the clinician initiated the following exchange. Part, are you the same thing as Ken, or are you different in any way? B, Bianchi, I'm not him. You're not him. Who are you? Do you have a name? I'm not Ken. You're not him. Okay, who are you? Tell me about yourself. Do you have a name I can call you by? Steve. You can call me Steve. And of course, once again, it wasn't Bianchi who did these horrible murders. He was innocent. There was this alter called Steve who actually had done the murders. And Steve claimed that Kenneth Bianchi had no knowledge of these murders whatsoever and was completely innocent. What a seductive alibi, right, for anyone who's charged with murder. He's not the first person to have tried that. You know, there's a Netflix series about a guy called Billy Milligan, who was a serial rapist who tried to pull that very same con. You know, so sometimes healthcare professionals are the ones who dupe their patients into this madness. And sometimes the criminals are kind of duping the well-meaning professionals into thinking of them as multiples. As the early hypnosis pioneer Hippolyte Bernheim used to say, it's the wise hypnotist who realizes who is hypnotizing whom. Now, there are a couple of things I want you to consider, at the end of this, and that is that we human beings do have some tendencies that makes it likely for us to produce these phenomena. So, for example, one of the interesting things about hypnosis and high hypnotizability is that some people can be suggested to that, for example, the number 4 is gone. And when you ask them to count from 1 to 10, they'll say 1, 2, 3, 5. And they just can't access the number 4. If they have high hypnotic capacity, you can do these interesting things where you suggest that they go open the window, for example, when you later give them a cue. And you can suggest that they have amnesia for the suggestion. And then as soon as you give them the cue and they start to walk towards the window, you interrupt them. And you ask them why they have to open the window. And you get these rationalizations that have absolutely nothing to do with the fact that they've been given a suggestion to open the window. Now, I'm not in the head of these people, so I can't know to what extent they're just role-playing and to what extent that they truly, really believe this. But I think with at least some people with high hypnotic capacity, they do have the capacity to actually do that. If you go back and you look at the split brain patients, Roger Sperry got a Nobel Prize for this back in, I think, 1981. They took these epileptic patients who had very severe epilepsy, and they did this surgery where they severed the connection in the corpus callosum between the two hemispheres. And after the surgeries, of course, now they could for the first time communicate with each hemisphere in isolation. So they might show a picture that instructed someone to move to the right hemisphere. And then as they started to move, they would stop and ask the left hemisphere, why are you moving? And instead of the left hemisphere honestly saying, you know what, I don't really know, I really haven't had access to the right hemisphere in a while, the left hemisphere would just make something up. So there are arguments to be made that the left and the right hemisphere can have very different motives and ways of perceiving the world which are occurring in the same person. Also, as the non-duality teacher, Gary Weber, often teaches, quoting the writer, what's her name? I can't remember the name right now, but hypnotic amnesia. But the quote is, there are as many I's or selves as there are relationships, meaning if you kind of watch yourself, you'll see that there's a different Jane if your name is Jane, or a different Pete if your name is Pete. There's a different Jane or Pete in different relationships. The one that shows up at work or with your mother or with your lover or in Brazilian jiu-jitsu class or whatever. There's not one autonomous, independent core self like an entity that's moving through time. That's actually a myth, There's a selfing process, but there are different senses of I that show up in various contexts. And of course, people can almost seem like different personalities depending upon their mood states. So there's an interesting book by the psychologist Dan Ariely on the topic of behavioral economics. It's called Predictably Irrational. And there's this experiment where you take college students and you ask them these questions like, could you ever put a drink into, spice a woman's drink to have sex with her? Would you ever press forward after she said no? Could you ever have sex with an underage girl? These sorts of questions. And they would answer them and they would predict how do you think you would answer if you were like in lust or extremely horny. And then they did this experiment, and don't ask me the details of how they did this. It's kind of hard to imagine, but they had these people watch porn and jerk off essentially, and at the height of their arousal, they would answer the same questions again. It was quite shocking how different the answers were when people were in like a lustful, horny, really aroused state, and how poor a job they did of predicting their responses while they were in the kind of neutral states, right? But what these multiple personality disorder folks claimed was not just that people can have swings in mood or show up differently in different contexts. It was this idea of repressed sexual abuse that the person had experienced but didn't know about, and that the core self could not hold that memory, so it had to be fragmented and held by these alters, and that these alters could take over control and not really know about each other, or the core personality not knowing about them. That is quite different. That is quite different. Now, the theory of dissociation still has quite a few people who endorse it. A very interesting guy is a guy called Bernardo Kastrup, who's a scientist and a philosopher, and who promotes analytic idealism. I'm going to write something here. I'm going to read something for you here in his latest book called Science Ideated. He does a pretty good job at questioning the whole philosophy of materialism. I think he makes a mistake, though, in that he thinks that dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality, that whole framework can explain the nature of reality. So what he does is that he refers to, in 2015, doctors in Germany, Strasburger and Waldvogel, I'm not good at German, reported the extraordinary case of a woman who suffered from what has traditionally been called multiple personality disorder, and today is known as dissociative identity disorder, DID. The woman exhibited a variety of dissociated personalities, alters, some of which claimed to be blind. Using EEGs, the doctors were able to ascertain that the brain activity normally associated with sight wasn't present, while a blind alter was in control of the woman's body, even though her eyes were open. Remarkably, when a sighted alter assumed control, the usual brain activity returned. This was a compelling demonstration of the literally blinding power of extreme forms of dissociation. And also here, modern neuroimaging techniques have demonstrated that DID is real. In a 2014 study, doctors performed functional brain scans on both DID patients and actors simulating DID. The scans of the actual patient displayed clear differences when compared to those of the actors, showing that dissociation has an identifiable neural activity fingerprint. In other words, there is something rather particular that dissociative processes look like in the brain. So these are likely highly hypnotizable people. Now, this does not take away from the very likely explanation that this has been suggested into existence. And I'll tell you why. So David Spiegel, a hypnosis researcher and clinician at Stanford, In 2005, did his famous believing is seeing experiments. He took highly hypnotizable subjects and low hypnotizable subjects, and he had their brain scanned while they were instructed to hallucinate color onto something that was black and white. With the highly hypnotizable folks, the color processing regions in both hemispheres of the visual cortex lighted up in the exact same way as it does when they see color. This did not at all happen with the low hypnotizables. Then they did the opposite. He had the highly hypnotizable folks negatively hallucinate color where there were supposed to be color. And once again, those areas of the visual cortex went inactive. That did not happen with the low hypnotizables. Similar experiments have been done with auditory hallucinations. With highly hypnotizable folks, you have them first listen to a tape of someone saying a particular phrase or sentence. You see which areas light up. They do hypnosis, and they're given the suggestion to auditorily hallucinate hearing the sentence, and the exact same areas light up, which does not happen to the low hypnotizable who are just imagining it. Anyways, I hope my ramblings on this topic were useful. I highly recommend getting the book Memory Warp by Mark Pendergrast, and the other book that I showed you today by Nicholas Spanos, the hypnosis researcher, Multiple Identities and False Memories. As always, know that I see clients online from all over the world. So if the way I think resonates with you and you'd like to explore if we could be a good fit for mentoring or change work, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. And as always, thanks for listening.